What's up, good people? My name is Henry. I am a people developer here at DevU. Today, we are going to cover at the very beginning of learning a program language, which is the data types and variables. Before we hop into that, our goal for today is one, understand what it means. Where do we write our code? Secondly, we want to understand the structure of a console application, which we are going to be uh, building and using these console application templates throughout these Flash classes. And then we want to understand the different data types within the C# programming language. And finally, we will work with variables and learn how they store information and then use that information to print messages out to the console. So a lot there. We're going to try to squeeze it in this Flash class, and then supplement Flash classes will give us more information. So let's start here with our console application. So a console application by definition is a text-based application. So when we look at the web and we look at applications on our phones or our tablets or whatever device we're working with, those applications have some sort of user interface that's graphic, right? It has pictures and colors and all those things. A console-based application, if you're old school and you go back to like going to the library and it's just text-based, right? It's just text that's going to be printed onto the screen or the console. So we're going to do a lot of our work in the console. Actually, we're going to do all of our work in the console. That way we can focus on the fundamentals of the language. And then later on down the road, eventually we'll get into some of those web components. So in IDE, integrated development environment, this is where, as a developer, this is where the magic happens. That's where you begin to code, right? There are many tools and benefits that we get from using an IDE, and there are various IDEs out there. The most common for writing in C# would be Visual Studio, and if you look up Visual Studio from Microsoft, there are free community editions that you are allowed to download. I strongly suggest to follow along that you download one of those. If you want something a little more lightweight and you're already familiar with development, then you can do a Visual Studio Code. But if you're new to it all, I would suggest downloading Visual Studio Community. Now, I am using a different IDE called Rider, and the only reason I am using this is because I am on a Mac, and it gives me some of the features that I'm used to on my Windows PC. So now that we've got the IDE, let's hop into the code. So the structure of our console application, no matter what IDE you are in, will look very similar, right? So we'll start out with our entire project. So if you look up here, I named my project Sandbox. Yours may say console application 1 if you didn't give it a name. So the sandbox, whatever you name your project, the application itself, that is going to be the folder that contains everything the application needs to actually run, okay? So if we dive down into that, as a part of that folder, there are subfolders. And in those subfolders, we have things like our dependencies, your configuration files, a lot of things that the IDE as a template kind of provides for you. We do not need to focus on those things right now. The only thing I want you to focus on is I want you to find a file called program.cs. And CS stands for C#. And this lets us know that this is a C# file called program. And if you click on that, it should go here and open up something very similar to this, where you have your namespace, which is the name that you gave to the application or project. Inside that namespace, you'll have a class called program. This is the file that we're currently in. And then inside of that, you have what is called a method. We'll talk about that later. But inside there is a main method. And this is where your program actually starts. This is where you will begin to write code. In between these two curly braces right here is where you, again, will begin to write code. We'll talk about structure and all those things later on, but we want to get our hands dirty, right? We want to get in there. So if we look here, I have made a few comments for us just to give us a start of what we're going to do and some definitions on some terms that I'm going to be using here. So if we look, notice that each of these lines have this forward slash in front of it. This right here lets us know that this is a comment, and comments are used in development as a way to sort of document or take notes with inside of your code. The benefit of doing comments, there are many, but one of the reasons we have comments is that we have to use this double forward slash to let the compiler, this is the thing that actually takes your code that you're writing here and convert it into something readable by your machine. This will take this and ignore all of this. So this will not cause any issues in your code. So I strongly suggest using comments throughout these Flash classes, just to kind of note to yourself what was going on, what you were doing here, right? Just like you're taking notes as you are learning the language. So our first objective is to learn about data types. Now, C# is considered a strongly typed language. And what that means is that any variable that we are going to create must have a data type in front of it, right? It needs to be declared as a specific data type. And we'll talk about variables just shortly here, but let's go over real quick these various data types. Now, there are other data types in the C# language, but we're going to start with these 5 here. So we have a string. A string is defined as a sequence of characters. So think of it as any words, groups of numbers, letters, paragraphs, etc. That is what we are going to call a string. The keyword int in C# stands for integer, and an integer will store a whole number. So nothing that is a fraction or a decimal. Then we have the keyword double. That's where we get the ability to store a number that is a fraction or decimal. Followed by char. Char means character, and a single character, if we look at our keyboard, any of the keys can be denoted as a single character. And then finally, we have this bool, which is short for Boolean, which will store true or false values, just true or false. And we'll talk more about that in a moment here. So those are some of the data types that we are going to focus on throughout. Again, there are more, but these are our basic ones. So let's get started here, and then we'll work our way from here. So the first one that we're going to start with is we're going to work with strings. So again, strings are a sequence of characters, right? If the letter T is a character, THE would be a string of characters that subsequently gives us a word, right? All right, so those are our data types. Let's talk about variables. What is a variable? So a variable essentially is we'll look at it as a container that stores a specific value. So in C# we have variables that can hold values, whether it's a string, an integer, a double, a char, a bool. And the benefit of having a variable is that we can store whatever we want inside this container and then use it throughout the rest of the program. So that way we only need to reference it one time in the container, and then throughout the program, we can use it over and over as opposed to having to repeat whatever we put in that one location. Let's see what that means. So let's say we start with we want to declare, and I'll do that here. So let's say we want to declare a string and assign it a value. So declaring a string, again, strongly typed, we must use the keyword string. So if we start to type out the keyword string, we'll notice that in the IDE, there's this thing called IntelliSense, and it will try and predict what we're trying to do, help us or assist us in our coding. And if you press tab, it will go ahead and finish out that word. So we have string, again, that's our data type. Then we need to give our variable a name. So the name that we're giving our variable, we're using that to reference or call the variable and say, hey, whatever's stored in that variable, I need the value or whatever's inside of it. So a rule in C Sharp, just as a best practice, we call these standards across the language so that everyone who writes C Sharp code is in agreement that, hey, these are the rules of the language, just like we have rules of the English language or whatever other language you may speak. There are rules within the language itself. So one of the rules is that variables need to be in what is called camel case. And all camel case means is that, let's say our string is going to be first name, right? We can't put spaces in our variables. They need to all be one word. And so what we're going to do is the first word always starts with a lowercase letter. So if we go first, and then the second word, let's say again, we're going first name, and every subsequent letter or word will have a capital letter to kind of differentiate it from the rest, right? So if we go first name, this is what we're considering camel case. So this is us declaring a string variable. And declaring means I am creating this space in memory to hold a value, right? First name is just a box that will be able to hold a string. It can't hold an integer or double or char or a boolean because we will get what's called an error or a compile error. It can only hold things that are strings, right? This box only holds strings. Now we can put something inside the box, a value inside this variable, by setting it equal to a string. So strings in C# are denoted by the quotation marks. So a set of quotation marks lets the compiler know that this variable or this value is a string. This is how we can visually see, oh, this is going to be a string. And inside those two quotations, I can put whatever series or sequence of characters I want, whether it's a word, a paragraph, numbers, etc. Right? So I'm just going to put, as it says, a first name. And we'll throw my first name in there. Finally, to let the compiler or the code know, like, hey, this is me writing my complete statement and I'm done. I want to terminate this. I will put a semicolon. So, recap. What did we just do there? What we did was we created a variable that is of the data type string. We named it first name using the convention of camel case, right? And then inside that variable, we have stored a string that holds the value Hemery or whatever you put for your first name. Okay? So what can I do with this, right? We have this variable, it holds a value. What can we do with this? Well, what we can do is we can take the value inside of first name and we can write it or print it to the console so that we can see it. Or if someone was using our application, they could see it. How do we do that? Follow along here. So there is a class, and we'll talk about classes later on, but there's a class called console. So if you start typing in console, notice that it pulls up. So if I go console, then followed by a period, then I'm going to start typing in capital W, right line. Notice that it also brings that up. Let's get rid of all that extra, right? Followed by a set of parentheses and a semicolon. Now, console write line is a method, and a method performs an action, right? So this is a method that is pre-built as a part of the language that will take whatever string you put inside of the parentheses and print that to the console. So this needs to take a string. Write lines always need to take a string value. So we are going to take first name as a variable because it is of data type string, right? And we're going to place that in there. And notice again, IntelliSense now knows that we have declared a variable called first name, so it can predict that we want to use that. And if I press tab, it places that inside of there. Now, my question to you is, when I run this or compile this application to get something to print to the console, what do you predict will print to the console? Think about it. And we'll validate. So somewhere on in your IDE, there should be a play button or run, right? And this right here is how we compile and get the application to actually execute. So if I go ahead and click this, it is going to execute as it says it's doing. And then this little black box for me is my console. If you're using a PC, let me add this extra step here. You will need to add in the line console.readline followed by a set of parentheses and a semicolon. And what this does is this will keep the console window open because if you do not have this, it will just kind of flash and you will think that your program did not run. So for those of us who are on PC, you will need to use the console.readline. This will keep your console active so that you can see if it actually printed a value. And for me, my value of first name was printed here, right? And this was, again, the value that was held in this variable. We there? You follow me? We dig? So if I do this again, right? If I go console.writeline again, and I throw in first name, what is your prediction that will happen now? Let's see. So I'll run it. It'll do its thing. It'll build. And we notice that Henry has printed twice. Well, why is that? Well, if we look at our program here, right, we have it writing the value of first name twice, which it did. All right, so the last thing I want to cover here is explaining that the way the program or the compiler is going to read your file is it is going to read it like a set of instructions. And this is very important. I think it was mind-blowing when I first figured this out. But what I mean by a set of instructions is notice that there are numbers here on this side, right? Not only are these numbers here to kind of be able to explain to you all or to someone else, hey, on line 25, we need to change something, right? And then I can immediately go line 25. Oh, you're talking about this line, right? But also notice that it goes from one and then it continues to build onto itself, right? So what's happening is that when this compiles, it is reading it as a set of instructions and it starts in sequence, right? So it's going to start at one and then it's going to go down and read everything. So it reads all these things, it gets to these comments, it ignores those, right? Because those are comments. That's what comment does, right? But then it gets to line 20, right? And it reads this and it says, all right, let me create a space in memory called first name. There's your container. Let me store in this container whatever value you said. Oh, you said Henry? Let me plop that in there. So now Henry or first name has Henry, right? Then it goes on to say, what's my next instruction? Oh, you want me to write to the console whatever stored inside this variable? Cool, Henry. Let me go ahead and write that to the console. Goes to the next line. Oh, you want me to do that again? Okay, Henry. And then finally, it gets to this read line, which again will just hold your console window open so that you can see or validate that these two things actually were written to the console. Beautiful. I do not want this to go on too long. Again, this is a flash class. It's supposed to be quick. You get in some information. I'm going to give you homework, and then on the next flash class, we will dive deeper. So my homework for you all is I want you to practice storing, wait, not storing, sorry, declaring and storing values in using the other data types, right? So we have the int, we have double, char, and bool. So I want you to practice declaring variables for those, putting values inside of those, and then finally trying to write those values to the console. If you get stuck or if you are lost, part of being a developer is being resourceful. So pull up that Google and then plop in what you're trying to do. If you're trying to declare an integer and store value, then say, how do I declare and store an integer in C#? And you should get some literature that you should be able to pick up and then help you solve your problem. All right, that is our time today. Hopefully you enjoyed this flash class. Please subscribe or come back for more. Until next time, deuces.